The Supreme Court has announced that they will be weighing in on Donald Trump's, the investigation over January 6th, the coup attempt, all of that. Now, this is a fast development and a surprising development in that the special counsel Jack Smith just appealed yesterday to the Supreme Court to sort of skip several of the normal steps that you might expect in this process and get a final decision on whether Trump's presidential immunity defense is going to be allowed. We did not expect that he would do that. And even once he did, we did not necessarily expect that the Supreme Court would so quickly respond to it. But they will do that. And so hopefully we'll have some sort of certainty about that soon. In terms of the argument for this, prosecutors have cited the 1974 US versus Nixon case, where the Supreme Court ruled that former President Nixon was required to turn over tape recordings during the Watergate scandal and that he was not protected by executive privilege. They need to go all the way back to 1974 because there is not a lot of cases that involve this, certainly at the level of the Supreme Court. So the precedent is not super clear as to, can he just get away with literally anything he wants because he was a president once? That's what he would like you to believe, what he would like the Supreme Court to believe. And bear in mind that this is a part of the immunity argument, is a part of his overall defense, much of which it isn't really a legal defense so much as a legal slowing down of the process. They really want these cases to be pushed off to after the 2024 election. They're still pushing for that. Right now, that particular trial is scheduled to go forward starting on March 4th, which if that was happened and it wasn't slowed down, and by the way, the immunity claims are a big tool that could be used by Trump's legal team to cause it to be slowed down, then we could get some sort of final decision, before the GOP primary is done, let alone before the general election is done, which certainly seems like, these cases are supposed to be adjudicated in an expeditious fashion, but also people deserve to know what actually happened. Is he guilty, so that they can choose with full information, not only between him and Joe Biden, but also possibly for one of the other Republicans. So we have more details. Rayyvana, I want your thoughts on this. There's a lot of developments just in a short period of time.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think a lot of people's gut reaction to this is going to be, well, Trump packed the Supreme Court. Of course, he's going to want them to make a decision on this because he thinks they'll rule in his favor. However, it's not Trump pushing for this to be expedited to the Supreme Court. It's the special prosecutor, because as you mentioned, the Trump's tactics are slow this thing down, get it moved back as far as possible, hopefully till after votes have been cast in the 2024 presidential election. What Trump's team actually wants to do is have this issue first raised at the appellate level, have it delayed as much there as possible before it's heard at the Supreme Court. Now, of course, like I mentioned, people do have this inclination that Trump thinks he's going to win at the Supreme Court, and maybe individually in his own deranged capacity, he does believe that, but his team is not nearly as confident as he is. We'll talk a little bit later about former members of his administration who also don't share that confidence. And the one person who obviously doesn't feel that way is Jack Smith, who wants the Supreme Court to hear this, feels confident that they will be ruling against Trump's argument, which is, his entire defense, essentially, in almost all of these cases, is simply that he has presidential immunity, which falls outside of what I believe is the scope of presidential immunity. I understand it in certain applications, but it's really hard to argue that he was acting within the duties of the president of the United States on that day, on the days that, before it, after it. And I've been accused of being overly optimistic about particularly this Supreme Court. And I understand why, but I do feel in this case that they will not be siding with Donald Trump and that they will, subscribe to a more limited view of the doctrine of presidential immunity.
You raised a lot of good points, and I'm just trying to hold in my head all the different things that I want to talk about now. So first of all, you're right, that is largely his defense in almost all of these. And obviously because those on the right support Trump, they have to support the legal defense that he is making. But can we just pause for a second to acknowledge how fundamentally, elementally elitist that defense is? They definitely would not apply this to any other president. Oh, so I suppose Biden can do pretty much anything he wants right now, right? And then just claim that he was immune later on. And every Republican will line up and say that that's totally acceptable. They definitely would not. They just support this because they think that it might help Donald Trump. And I'm doing sort of the same thing that I guess you're doing, and the audience are doing, is like trying to read the tea leaves, like how likely is this thing to work? So Jack Smith is pushing for it, which implies that he thinks he has a good chance. Or, I mean, you could say maybe he doesn't necessarily think that he has an amazing chance, but he kind of has to rush it either way. And so maybe it is a Hail Mary, which, by the way, is what Trump's spokesperson is saying. They're saying that it's him trying for a Hail Mary by racing the Supreme Court and passing the appellate process. But again, to say that is to say, if they think that Jack Smith will lose, if they think that the constitutional legal argument for presidential immunity is strong, then they should be cheering this, right? In particular, because it's going to go to a Supreme Court that he has put so many people on. So the fact that Jack Smith is pushing for it gives me some confidence. I'm trying not to fall into the same trap that people had with the prior special counsel and assuming that they can do no wrong or whatever. But in this case, Jack Smith seems more competent. He seems confident. They don't seem to like this, the Trump people, other than actually Trump. So that also gives me confidence. So I do bear in mind that it's a conservative Supreme Court, but it's not a Supreme Court that has always been specifically supportive of Donald Trump in general. They support much of what he supports, but that does not mean that they are going to set a strong precedent for president being able to do literally anything they want just to save Donald Trump. So I don't know, weigh in. What do you think?
Yeah, so I obviously don't think that the Supreme Court is, filled with individuals who are, unimpeded by bias and just the most intelligent legal scholars in the United States. Obviously not. Brett Kavanaugh is there, for God's sakes. That being said, they aren't in a position where they necessarily have to be beholden to Donald Trump, despite the fact that he appointed them to the Supreme Court, because I always refer to them as our 9 unelected wizards who get to control pretty much every aspect of our lives, because they're not really in any danger of being removed from their positions, until they decide they want to retire or die. And they do have allegiances to the Federalist Society and aspects of the Republican Party, but they've shown that they're not necessarily, they are firm in their commitment to right-wing values and conservative values. Like we saw, they overturned abortion; they had no issue doing that. Promoting, ridiculous standards of allowing Christianity to be taught in schools, and prayers being led at the 50-yard line in high school football games. But this is not necessarily a tenet of the Federalist Society. It's not one of the big projects that they've been trying to pass for decades. This is just something that Trump needs right now in order to defend himself in these cases. So I think we're a little more likely to see some of the conservative justices rule against it. Obviously, I have no hopes for individuals like Alito or definitely not Clarence Thomas, but we'll just have to see how this plays out. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to be optimistic about it, but of course, as you pointed out, there is the option that Jack Smith doesn't necessarily see a high success rate in this, but just needs to have this decision early so he can better prepare the prosecution. Yeah. But I don't know. I think it's more likely than not that they will rule against Donald Trump. At least his argument, in this case.
Well, and I would quickly throw in he might think this is a 30% chance of succeeding, but if I don't, and if this thing gets pushed back beyond the general election, then the entire thing just disappears. I literally have no chance in that case. Trump will win. Trump will just get rid of it. He might be worried about that. Really fast though, because you mentioned Clarence Thomas, and I'm glad that we have a lawyer on the show. Talk to us about grounds for recusal, because Clarence Thomas notably is married to his wife, who is pretty inextricable from the January 6th, the legal efforts to overturn the election. Ginny Thomas, I should say, was involved in a lot of this. So it kind of seems like he should recuse himself. But what do you think?
He won't. I mean, there was a case that I think more directly implicated his wife, and he didn't recuse himself then. I'd have to more carefully review because they recently put in a new code of ethics. It's not so much about recusal, but more about getting gifts and donations from donors. And maybe there's something in there that might lend itself to him being more likely to recuse himself, but I don't think he will. He's shown he's shown no issue hearing cases that directly implicate his wife, wealthy donors, individuals who have Nazi museums that he gets to tour when he visits their house. So I really don't think, unless there is a massive pressure campaign, and even then, that he would recuse himself. I think that he will definitely be hearing this.
I think you're probably right. But anyway, I just, because there's supposed to be this concept of ethics in law, in particular for Supreme Court justices who are not base humans with biases. They are divine creatures of objectivity. One would think that they would abide by these sorts of ethical things, but now I'm starting to think maybe they are humans. Maybe they're not perfect and just. But anyway, we'll see. We'll see. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.